Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 66 of the Ask Historians podcast. So today, I just want to point out two things about this episode, just right off the bat. The first is we are going to have a slight audio dropout about 8 to 10 minutes into the interview. You're not really losing anything. It's just a few seconds. It was a weird, bad internet connection. And we'll pick right back up off about talking about the push-pull influences that moved people out of the South into other parts of the country. If you have not looked at the title of this podcast, that push-pull and that migration is, of course, the Great Migration, which is, of course, the movement of African Americans from the South into other parts of the country, particularly the Northeast and particularly the Midwest, but also out to California as well, and the West Coast. Well, mostly California. Oregon has its own weird history that maybe we'll touch on someday. It's probably not what you're expecting to hear about Oregon. The point is that the Great Migration is kind of the backdrop of what we're going to be talking about today. But we're also going to, and this brings me to my second point, we're also going to kind of stray, as we don't usually do on Ask Historians, even on the podcast, which is a bit looser about this. We're also going to stray a bit more into modern politics. So just to keep in mind that this episode covers a lot of ground. It's one of our shorter ones, but it's a dense and very informative and at times very entertaining podcast as well. Dr. Ford, our guest, and I had we had fun doing this one. But keep in mind that we are going to be going from essentially, well, not so much slavery, but we are going to be going from the Jim Crow era and literally, Plessy versus Ferguson almost all the way up to modern day. So we're going to be talking a lot about not simply the Great Migration and, Black people moving into these areas and trying to find jobs in this industrializing nation and kind of the discrimination they face. And we're also not going to just be talking about the Communist Party, which could be communists in the United States could be very much their own episode. And maybe one day we'll focus on that. But we're going to be focusing more on, we're going to be kind of condensing and glossing over that aspect to mainly focus on the people who are involved in it. But we're also going to be focusing on women and their involvement, and particularly Black women and their involvement with both the Communist Party and as part of this Great Migration. And also we're going to be talking about this strain of radicalism that flows through the Black community and flows through the Black experience all the way from, our time period, from basically slavery up until present day. And we're going to end really talking a little bit about things that kind of touch on present day events. And I just want to point out that this episode was actually recorded, a couple weeks before the events which have been in the news. So just to keep that in mind, that, this was not recorded in reaction to events in, Minnesota or events in Louisiana or events in Texas. It's just happens to be that this is something that we were talking about, and the events of the world caught up to what we were talking about in a historical fashion. So keep that in mind. We are going to be going basically from Jim Crow to Black Lives Matter on this episode. So I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, I am here with Melissa Ford, or shall I say Dr. Melissa Ford. She has recently earned her PhD. And today, we're going to be talking a great deal about kind of early 20th century African Americans, particularly African-American women, and labor movements and the Communist Party and all sorts of those things that I guess really get you up in arms with black and red bandanas. So, Melissa, could you go ahead and give us an idea about what got you interested in this topic?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. This is quite the honor. But what really got me interested in this topic was the regionality issue, I think, is something that we could touch on, especially after we get details down. But coming from St. Louis, I was always kind of concerned or wondering why no one ever talked about St. Louis. And during my research of just kind of the history of St. Louis for a specific research paper I was doing, I came across this 1933 strike of about 800 African-American women who, in coordination with their local Communist Party, successfully struck in nut-picking factories in downtown St. Louis. And this is a history I'd never heard of. First of all, that there are communists in St. Louis, that there are Black women workers in St. Louis, that they worked together and they struck, and then also that they were successful in this strike. And so me being curious, I had to know what else was going on during this time, in this period, in this region, that precipitated such a unusual strike and product of history. And what I came to realize is it wasn't very unusual. And we're seeing this type of radical organizing in African-American women across the Midwest. And so part of my project is to really reclaim African-American women and radicalism as a part of Midwestern history.
Well, let's kind of start to break that down a little bit, because you'd said that St. Louis isn't the kind of place where you would think about this, and I think most people, when they generally think of the Midwest, I guess two things. Perhaps they do think of strikes, kind of Chicago labor unions, things like that. But I'm pretty sure that most people, when they think of Midwest, they don't think Black people. So, what was the context of these kind of people living there and getting involved in these actions?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1930s, the African Americans we're talking about live in these urban areas are majority recent Southern migrants. So in cities like Cleveland, you had 60% of the Black population were from the South. And this happened not right after, but in the years after the First World War. You're seeing Black populations in cities like Chicago go from 2% to 7% of the population. And in St. Louis, it doubled as well. So you've seen these Black populations explode in these cities during the years 1919 to about 1930. And that's, again, something that no one talks about, because this Great Migration is what it's called of Southern Blacks to the North is often framed as either Blacks are going to Chicago and creating the Chicago community, or going to Harlem and New York and creating that community. So there are two kind of ways that research has gone. So by looking at individual cities, which I've done, I look at Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and St. Louis, you can really pick apart and really analyze how these Black populations were affected during this time.
So clearly they were going up there looking for what most people, I assume, were going to places like St. Louis and Cleveland and Chicago were going for, which is the promise of jobs and the promise of, a good wage for those jobs. Were they going up there? I have one question I want to get to in just a second, but I kind of want to start by asking, were they going up there kind of alone? Were these single men and women going up, or were these whole families packing up and, heading north and Midwest?
The push and pull factors of migration. And so some of the push factors is what propelled Blacks to leave the South. And that's racism, lack of jobs, unemployment, things like that you think of. And then the pull factors are what these northern cities kind of use to draw workers in. And so that's jobs. But we're also talking about huge propaganda campaigns like the Chicago Defender saying how amazing life is in these urban cities. And so when we're looking at single Black workers, we're looking at Black families, we're looking at former sharecroppers, grandchildren of slaves who just never were able to make inroads in the city and urban industrial work. So we're looking at both these single and families moving north for jobs, but for also protection against racism, de jure racism. And so what they found when coming to cities like Chicago, Cleveland, was de jure racism, which is more is socially accepted racism rather than legally.
Yeah, because
accepted.
At the time they were talking about, this is still, Jim Crow South.
Right. So I think one of the interesting things is, and this kind of speaks to what the regional confines of the Midwest is, in St. Louis, on the train, if you're going north, that's where they would switch over the signs and say segregated or to non-segregated. So we're talking about these very specific limits of where racism supposedly starts and ends. But then in St. Louis, you're still seeing interracial marriage is prohibited. There's horrible racial segregation in housing and jobs. And so this Jim Crowism didn't really stop when the train switched over the sign from white to non-white or whatever. You're still looking at these prevailing factors.
Do we see, I guess this would probably be no surprise to anyone, the answer that I'm pretty sure you're going to give, but do we see that African Americans who have traveled up to these, Midwestern cities, do they also end up in kind of conditions that are not much different from the South?
Oh, absolutely. If we had more time, I would quote all the newspaper articles I found of people writing into Black newspapers saying, I came here for a job. I can't find anything. What is this? I should have just stayed in Mississippi. And in fact, one of the nicknames for Cleveland was Alabama North, because it was just seen as just such a repeat of the conditions of Alabama. So you're looking at a huge disillusioned population of African-American workers who can't find jobs, who are underemployed, who are homeless, who are living in really bad slums, as we would call them. And that's really where my story starts, because you're looking at this population that can't find answers within the institutions that are already existing. They're looking to their local urban league to get them jobs, but the urban league is just overwhelmed with requests. They're looking to the NAACP. NAACP doesn't have any measures in place to help these poor populations. And then you're looking at the Universal Negro Improvement Association and Garveyism. And again, there's nothing in place to help these people. And so that's when you're talking about these recent migrants living in horrible conditions, not too separated from the South, thinking, what can we do and who's going to help us? And that's really when the communists and radicalism step in.
Well, before we jump too far ahead to that, well, I guess not too far ahead, but before we take that next step, clearly some of these people were getting jobs and were finding, work and in a way to settle and make a life for themselves. So, what kind of jobs were these migrants, to these cities? What kind of jobs were they finding?
Well, it really depends on the city. When you look at Detroit, you're obviously going to look at automobile industry. It's the one industry city. Ford Motor Company drew tens of thousands of African-American men to the city, where they were working in the River Rouge complex and other industrial factories. And they were just horrible jobs. But there was still the promise of Ford called the $5 day, where you could get $5 regardless of race for your work. So there's some industrial labor like that, and certainly in Cleveland and Chicago and the slaughterhouses in St. Louis. You also had other like nut factories or food factories and stuff like that. So for Black men, there are usually labor and industrial jobs that could be held. Whether or not they could be retained is a different story. Last hired, first fired was always the kind of rhyme of Black workers. And then when you're talking about African-American women, you're mostly looking at domestic service. Domestic service is widespread for Black women in the South. And when these women came north, that's what they knew how to do, and there were just no job opportunities. But there were a significant amount, not a significant, but there was always the hope for these domestic workers to actually get out of the domestic industry and get into industrial work, which was seen as a step up.
And probably paid better as well.
Yes.
Now, was this a situation where, because you had mentioned that a lot of them were doing these kind of like very dirty, grimy work. Was this a situation where even first hired or last hired, first fired, was this still a situation where even if you did get hired, advancement would pretty much be barred? You'd probably be being paid less than someone doing the same kind of job who would be white.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Some of the core issues that I study in the couple of strikes during 1933 are these African-American women having issues with the fact that white women are being paid more, work less hours, and have easier jobs. And that was rampant around any industry, really.
So let's talk about then this dissatisfaction, both, because it sounds like we have people who are moving up, to this kind of hopeful paradise away from the poverty and the racism of the South, and are encountering the poverty and racism of the Midwest. And that's even those who can get jobs, and those who can't even get jobs are of course living in these slums, but they're living right next to people who have jobs, but it sounds like they're very tenuous and they're very kind of terrible jobs, and they're very poor paying jobs, and kind of the racism and discrimination sounds like it's pretty upfront and in your face. So where does the Communist Party come into this then?
So this is a longer story. I'll try to make it easy, because communist history can be especially convoluted.
And filled with acronyms.
Oh my goodness, yes. So I'm going to stick specifically to the American Communist Party, which is called the CPUSA. I just may call it the American Communist Party. In 1928, the American Communists basically said, we're going to specifically target African-American workers to bring into the party. Within this time, they're looking at ways in which to recruit African-American workers. We have community organizing through the unemployed councils, where communists would literally go into the neighborhoods to help people get on welfare, what we would call welfare today. It was called relief then, to provide free meals for the hungry and shuttle services for elderly people. So we're talking about community organizing like that directly in these Black neighborhoods. And we're also talking about labor organizing because the communists were the first majority white organization to really promote interracial organizing. And that was through the trade union Unity League and through various labor unions under them.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that, the NAACP, Garvey's UNIA, the Urban League, all these other organizations, I mean, it sounds like they were present, but they weren't fulfilling some sort of, vital role that the American Communist Party was.
Right. So one of the things that's so interesting about the Communist Party is that because it was structured under the Communist International or Comintern, or really just the Soviets' influence, there were strict hierarchies and rules and ways to do things. You had sections that were, or districts that were divided into sections that were divided into units that were divided into shop nuclei versus community nuclei. And so there's a very rigid structure and organization that when the communists entered these neighborhoods, they were able to kind of draw upon that experience and their experience in organizing. So you have these mass movements starting in the neighborhoods where you have one person speaking out on a soapbox saying, unemployment is rampant, we deserve wages, blah, blah, blah. And then being able to take the spectators, rally them, and march to the local welfare station where they demand that officials give out immediate relief. And they were successful in many instances like this. And they would march on City Hall, they would march on certain politicians' doorsteps, because the communists were already experienced in this sort of mass demonstration. So, the Urban League and NAACP were not going to do this. They were mostly representing more respectable middle to upper class populations. Now, the Urban League was definitely interested in organizing or finding jobs for Black workers, but they're not interested in labor organizing. They were not interested in the really, really poor urban population.
It sounds like they weren't interested in being rabble-rousing, in the idea that that kind of burden of being, to be Black and successful, you have to be respectable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, precisely. So lack of that organizational support from those traditional institutions created this void, which the Communist Party and communists were really trained and well equipped to step into and offer immediate results.
And not afraid to lead a mob to a politician's doorstep.
Oh, man. Yes, there's some great stories. I think one of the most visible and dramatic activities they did were anti-eviction protests, where if a family was evicted, communists would rally the neighborhood and literally put the furniture back in the homes, just restoring the family. They would break the lock on the door and say, okay, now you live here again. And when the landlord came back and said, well, what? And it was like, well, you can't do anything. There's hundreds of people in front of this house and the family's already been restored into their home. So is this kind of, I can kind of, non-caring. I don't know. They're communists. They're crazy sometimes, or they're very. The thing with like the NAACP is if you do something like that, you run the risk of being labeled communist. But if you're communist already, you have nothing else to lose. So why not stand in front of the sheriff saying, no, you can't pass? Because there's literally nothing else to lose.
I can certainly see the appeal of having that group that is not afraid to do what others are trying to kind of tiptoe around. But, you had mentioned previously that there's this connection, the Comintern, the Soviets, how much, because I know this is always the accusation that gets thrown at, any communist group or even, any socialist group, but really, what was the connection between the Communist Party USA at this time and the Soviets, which at this time would be, Stalin's Soviet Union?
Right. Oh, man, something that is a huge debate still going on. It's been going on for half a century in American communist history, where, there's two sides, really, that say the American communists were puppets of the Soviet Union, and the other side says American communists, were independent actors of their own will. And I think the truth is somewhere in between. You certainly had the Comintern dictating specific theoretical doctrine. So you're looking at 1928. The Comintern solicited the resolutions on the Negro question, which really gave the American communists the impetus to recruit Black workers. And so that came from above. But then you're looking at things like the eviction efforts, the anti-eviction efforts. That's literally starting on the street. That's as grassroots as you can get. There's no order from Stalin that says, all right, at this time in this place, you're going to march onto this house. No, it's this radicalized population getting upset with something, and there's that immediate need for action. And that's what the American communists on the grassroots level really provided. So there's something in between, and that's usually what history is. It's never black and white. It's something in between. And I think by looking at those in-between things and that grassroots level, you can really pick apart what makes American communism so interesting.
But you'd also mentioned that this was, in contrast to things like the Urban League or the NAACP, that this was primarily a white organization. And, it seems like if there's any kind of stereotype of people who are involved in communist movements, it's that, white people going into people of color's neighborhoods and saying, this is how you need to live your life, and being kind of, I guess you could say, their minds a little too high in the sky and not down on the ground. But it sounds like there was some real kind of genuine kind of grassroots attention to local concerns, and it seems like that that may have earned them some kind of some affection, you might say.
I believe the historical term is street cred. And yes, and certainly these anti-eviction efforts, in particular, one young black man was named Claude Lightfoot, was so taken by those relief efforts. He was a former member of the UNIA, and he was looking for something to kind of fulfill his impetus for activism. And he found the unemployed councils and the communists and said, well, I can do this. And he soon became one of the biggest leaders on Chicago's South Side for the African-American community. So there's certainly ways the African-American men and women could get involved.
Yeah, you've kind of already once again presaged my next question, which was that how much for these local people, you have the people coming in from outside and saying, hello, we're the communists. But, at some point, does the local community start becoming the leaders of these, this kind of very regimented system of communist organizing? Like with the industrial jobs they're finding, was there a cap on how high they could get into the structure?
I wouldn't say there's a cap, but there is always this idea of white chauvinism is the term they use, that blacks are just, or African Americans in the party were just kind of tokenism and token members to kind of say that, look, we're not racist, we have black members, of course, in a better way than that. But there are certainly black leaders at high levels. William Patterson was an African American from the South. Oh, I'm sorry. James Ford is the one. No relation, by the way.
He was not the son of the famous Ford Motor Company.
No, and he's not related to me either. But he was a migrant from the South and moved to Chicago and became one of the leading African Americans in the party. And he was actually nominated for vice president on their presidential ticket. So there's certainly ways that blacks could get ahead in the party. But there's also this idea that there's the white chauvinism that if you don't play along with the rules of the party and everything, you're not going to get ahead. So we're seeing both again. It's that fuzzy middle where, like, yes, you can get ahead, but at the same time, you might be accused of just being kind of like that affirmative action person in the committee or whatever.
And kind of an expectation to conform to kind of the social mores that the Communist Party has brought to it, which would primarily be, of course, kind of these white social mores, in the sense that I guess I'm just thinking of institutions where, if you're too black in an institution, it's seen as kind of counting against you.
Yeah.
we may be straying off topic a little bit there.
I'm thinking of, Lovett Fort Whiteman, who was purportedly the first African-American recruited into the Communist Party. And he was huge. He wrote for the Communist Party journals and publications. He was a leader, and he led mass rallies and protests. He went to the Soviet Union to study, and there he kind of developed ideas that were, let's just say, separate from the Communist Party. And he ended up dying in a Siberian labor camp because of those separate ideas. So yeah, there's this idea is that because the Comintern and the Communist Party had such rigid rules and theoretical doctrine that you had to follow, there were major consequences if you didn't. And that's why we're seeing a lot of blacks not join the party. When you're talking about these anti-eviction riots or thousands of people in the park listening to a speaker, most 99.9% of those African Americans are not going to join the party. But they are going to go to meetings They are going to demand unemployment insurance. They are going to use relief to help and better their lives. And they might join labor unions. So you're talking about a Communist Party that really wants African Americans in their midst, but only by their own rules.
Yeah, and you've kind of once again presaged the next question I was going to ask, which is, how, ideologically pure were the people joining the Communist Party? Were these people being attracted to it because of the, the ideology of communism and, owning the means of production? Or was this more of just kind of like, thanks for your help with these evictions and much more practical concerns?
So that's one of the beautiful things about American communism is American communism was kind of on this grassroots level an interpretation of whatever you kind of want to make, not like whatever it is, but it's kind of what does it mean to you? And the phrase that I use a lot because it just makes so much sense is Nell Irvine Painter's phrase that African-American communists during this time, quote, made the party their own. And so they kind of took parts they liked, took parts they didn't like, or throw those away, and you're really left with this unique interpretation of communism. So one of the examples I have is Carrie Smith, who was one of the strike leaders in this 1933 strike in St. Louis. She was extremely religious. She brought her Bible to the strike picket lines. She led everyone in prayer, and they sang hymns. And if you know anything about communism, no, religion is the opiate of the etc. But the fact is, she called herself comrade. She wrote for a communist journal and was close with these white communists, but at the same time she was super religious. So that's kind of this melding of making this party your own, this communist doctrine. I like the working class part, and then I also like religion. So we're kind of she's going to make it her own.
Kind of getting to what we were setting out to talk about here, she's also a woman at this time. And I think a lot of times when people are thinking about these labor movements in the early 20th century, late 19th century, we're really thinking about men in them because we're thinking about people working in these industrial conditions. And therefore, just because of the way those jobs were set up at the time and kind of the kind of at times legal and at times, just de facto cultural sexism that excluded women from those jobs, is that we think of men being at the forefront of these things. But I know also that communism also has this strain in the sense that, while they see like, okay, race shouldn't matter between the people, there's also kind of a strain of kind of gender egalitarianism as well.
There definitely is, but I think at this time, 1930s, the Communist Party is still really intent on formulating how race figures into communism. And it isn't until 1940 and 1950s that the Communist Party really faces upfront this issue of gender. So gender is not really on the table. The women who they're organizing are Black workers. They're not Black working women. I mean, of course they are, but in the communist conception, you're a worker first, then it's your race, and then this kind of fuzzy delineation of gender, which they elucidate later.
What was the extent of women's involvement at this time? Because was the Communist Party really just looking to focus on, mobilizing these industrial workers, of which there'd just be very few women, or were women kind of going and finding them and joining themselves?
So they're very intent on industrial labor. When you're looking at domestic service, which the majority of Black women were employed in, communists were not interested in organizing domestic workers at this time because the Great Depression put thousands of industrial workers out of work. The Communist Party really zoned in on that and honed in on the men, like you mentioned, that were in those positions. But there's always that minority, right? And the minority is the really interesting part, I think, and that the minority is the thousands of African-American women. I mean, not hundreds of thousands, but maybe 10,000 African-American women in the Midwest who are employed in industrial organizations. And the Communist Party, knowing that and seeing their jobs being threatened or the bad labor practices, the Communist Party was able to kind of step in there because they were industrial workers.
What about things like the American Federation of Labor or other kind of big traditional labor unions that we usually think of?
So the AFL was not interested in African Americans nor women. The CEIO was not yet formed. That happened in 1935, and very much so where they were progressive on race and gender issues, but that's a little problematic. So really no one was organized, no labor unions were organizing African American women because they didn't see that minority of industrial workers and they just didn't care.
Of course, this is also kind of in I guess you'd say kind of a weird time in women's rights, in the sense that, the suffrage movement had kind of, at this point, hit and won. The 19th Amendment had been passed, and women had the right to vote. But it was still, before that kind of the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s off. So, I mean, what was kind of the status of the women's movement at this time?
I think you're absolutely right. There's this lull. I think there's a perception of a lull. But if you want to talk about African-American women in these strikes, you could, and I did make the argument, and I have made the argument, that they're asserting a type of radical feminism that was totally unusual for their day and kind of presaged, I like your term there, the radical Black feminism we saw in the 1970s and 80s. But they're doing it in a very different way. These women like Carrie Smith, yes, she was very religious, but at the same time, she was very militant in her efforts. She was on the front lines of these strikes, but she was also a mother, and she was very concerned about that her work would not be able to provide for her family. And so you've seen all these ties in of she's a worker, but she's a mother, she's Black, but she's still a worker. And so that's what the term would become, is intersectionality. So you're seeing her deal with these issues of intersectionality in a time when mainstream feminism would not consider very active. So I think you can make the argument, and I do, that there is feminism happening there, and that absolutely needs to be a part of this kind of longer history of American women.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is, well, we've been speaking a lot of kind of this in the abstract, but you've brought up this one particular individual again. But who were these women? Let's focus in on maybe just a couple of their own stories. Absolutely,
I'm so glad. I think the stories is the best part. When we forget the stories, then that's when the history really suffers. So I'll tell you the stories, a few of my favorite ones. Rose Billups was the wife of an auto worker in Detroit. And when her husband got laid off, she started to get involved in these unemployment council movements and kind of provide for homeless and hungry workers. So she would solicit bones and leftover meat from butchers and leftover beans from farmers, and she'd make these huge pots of stew that would attract hundreds of hungry homeless people. And according to her husband, she wasn't very good at it, but the people got to eat. Later, she went on to become one of the organizers for women's auxiliaries of the United Auto Workers Union. So her involvement in unemployment ultimately led her to huge involvement in the labor movement. Other stories, let's see. Maggie Jones, who was an African-American working woman in Cleveland, who was involved in the unemployment councils to the point where she led and organized the largest council in Ohio. And after there was an anti-eviction riot where 2 African-American men were killed by police, after that she organized a corps of women nurses to address issues of violence against police in the future. So she's learning these lessons on the fly and immediately saying, now this is something that women can do. And she's saying the women are absolutely a part of this war, which she terms is a battle with the established police.
Go ahead.
We're talking about wives. Or Maggie Jones was, I think, a housewife. Carrie Smith was an industrial worker. Others are just mothers who kind of needed to provide for their children. And we're talking about women across the board. And there's really no one right model.
Well, I mean, I guess one unifying thing would be that they are women, and I think, to go back to kind of the idea that this is an odd time for women's rights, were they ever kind of told to kind of stop being out on the front lines, stop organizing, these large marches, and kind of go home and take care of their kids?
Yes and no. I do have a few stories about white women being told that, because there are higher standards of respectability for white women. There's one woman and her husband who is particularly active in Cleveland, and one judge sentenced them to jail time. And he's like, don't you have anything better to do? And he literally said that, don't you have anything? And so with Black women, though, we're talking about, especially Black women workers, we're talking about not a huge, I don't know how to term this, but the social respectability thereafter is at a lower level, I guess you can say, but they have so little to lose at this point. If they're destitute industrial workers out of work,
there's kind of an
perception doesn't matter.
Yeah, there's kind of already less of an assumption that they should be these genteel ladies keeping house.
Right. And I think also part of the other side of the coin is there is still that idea that the woman should be in the home, but they're breaking that in order to go to work. And so there's that also the strains of feminism kind of coming in at this early age.
Well, what about from, their fellow members in the Communist Party then?
No. Work first, labor first for the communists. That's as easy as it.
If you're a worker, you're in. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, pretty much.
To kind of focus in on what they were kind of agitating for. So we talked about things like evictions, and we've talked about this kind of this one woman who was basically a one-woman soup kitchen. But do we find that women in this movement have kind of different demands that they're looking for as compared to some of the men, or even some of the more like the higher up echelons of the Communist Party?
Yes, and there's a scholar, I quote, who basically says that all women's social movements at this time are founded in the home because these women are reacting to their jobs and their roles as caretaker, whether it's mother, whether it's wife, whether it's taking care of an extended family. So there's this large sense of these women are doing this for their families. You still see that in men's labor agitation, but to a lesser extent. In fact, in men's labor agitation, you still have the women coming to their strike lines to give them sandwiches or whatever. But women, there's this larger sense that their impetus for action is rooted in their domestic roles.
So what I want to kind of do right now is maybe transition a little bit towards more the theoretical sides of things and ask a little bit about how this period, and compare it a little more towards the black radicalism of the 60s and the black radical feminism of that time period as well.
Sure. There's a new strand of scholarship coming out that is really exciting, but it basically connects 1930s, 1940s African-American women in communism to 1970s radicalism to today. And work like by Eric McDuffie and Deo Gore really do a tremendous work on that. So in terms of like specific connections, if you look at Angela Davis, she was a member of the Communist Party, and she also had connections to black women who were alive in the 1930s and 40s doing this activism. So there's like a direct lineage that we can draw. And you see that in several instances of so-and-so taught so-and-so who is now here. So there's that like physical almost relationship, but there's also that theoretical of picking up on these ideas. And that's what scholars basically term Cedric Robinson, the late Cedric Robinson. He just died this week. It's just horrible, but termed the Black radical tradition. And so this idea is that there's a long history of African Americans and people of African descent responding to the specific institutions of oppression wrought by white capitalism. So you're looking at women interpreting that for their own specific time and place throughout the century. 1930s women did it maybe by making soup, by organizing a strike. You look at 1950s, you're talking more about labor organizing. In 1960s, that's when you get to our more modern conception of radicalism. 1970s and 80s is really more of the black radical feminism that you see with people like Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, that really are still drawing on these notions that of intersectionality that I mentioned earlier, that race, class, and gender are all come together in African-American women, and nobody really talks about that.
Yeah, well, how direct a connection is there? Because I think if anyone is familiar with American history, as we go into the 50s, as we kind of go out of this period of, mass labor unrest and into the World War II and kind of the immediate post-war era, it was not a good time to be a communist in the United States.
No, it was not. That's why we're seeing a lot of scholarship calling it just radicalism, because it wasn't necessarily communism. If you look at Rosa Parks, everyone knows Rosa Parks and everyone loves Rosa Parks until you look at her very radical conception of Black rights. And Barbara Ransby in her new biography talks about these radical roots that Rosa Parks was drawing from and how she was actually quite militant and quite radical in the sense that she wanted to challenge these white leaders in a way that wouldn't necessarily go along with our way of thinking of the civil rights movement. So you do have women like Rosa Parks and Ella Baker, founder of SNCC, that are coming from very radical places, but are housing their demands in terms that are more suitable for mainstream civil rights movements. And that's what scholars recently have been talking about, how this is due to Cold War influence, that it was such a horrible thing to be labeled a communist that these radical men and women were kind of going underground and kind of putting some of the more radical issues to the back burner in order to kind of to agitate for civil rights.
And not just get immediately discounted as, just a communist controlled by Moscow.
Right. I mean, if you look at Paul Robeson, he was one of the most popular singers in the 1940s, but as soon as he aligned with the communists, he died destitute and alone, and no one wants that. So there's very real dangers in asking for labor rights and workers' rights, even if you wanted to.
So, but, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's one way of interpreting this would be that, because we'd already talked about the fact that a lot of the draw of the Communist Party in this kind of 1920s, 1930s period was that it was focusing on very, very literally meat and potatoes issues, roof over your head, a bowl of stew at the end of the day. Yeah. And while it may have had this, veneer of communism on it and been organized through that, the draw of it was this actual substantive repeal. And so even while the communist label became, verboten, you might say, in the post-war period, only to, resurge back up in the 60s and 70s, but, that radicalism that drew people to the Communist Party beforehand, rooted in these really basic issues, that never went away.
Right. I mean, and it has its different iterations. So some scholars may say, well, it's not black radicalism because they weren't talking about this. But I think it's more fruitful to look at it as kind of like an ebb and flow of black radicalism, peaks and declines, that, yeah, it's still there. It may not be at its most prevalent, but it's still there.
Let's kind of edge towards a conclusion here. And I just want to ask, what were the kind of tangible gains that the Communist Party USA, the American Communist Party, was able to get during this earlier 20th century period? Unemployment
insurance. They were the first to kind of agitate for that. Also, interesting enough, they agitated for maternity insurance, which never kind of came to fruition. But it's that idea that the government should cover their medical expenses and medical leave for pregnancy and maternity issues. Anyway, so unemployment insurance was huge. They kind of put that into the vernacular of demands. And when you're talking about 1935, you're talking about New Deal programs, you're talking about social welfare, and unemployment insurance was implemented in the New Deal programs of 1935, and it was more acceptable because the communists had been putting it on front pages forever. Not forever, for several years. In terms of more tangible results of communism and this radical agitation, especially among African American women, there's something to be said for looking for those tangible answers when I don't think the Black radical tradition really produces at all times that end that we can see and we can point at. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter, is they're drawing on very similar ideas of what we saw in the 1930s and what we saw in the 1960s and 70s, because there's really no end to this Black radical tradition, this search for equality and race, class, gender, how we include nation and sexuality in that, because that's so tied to the African American lived experience that it can't be really answered or can't be solved, and there's really no endpoint.
Because the root of it is so fundamentally intertwined with the society itself, right?
Right.
Yeah, so in a way, it's part of its productivity is in a sort of way kind of changing the discourse, you might say, if you were Michel Foucault.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can look at Barack Obama as one of these tangible results. He came from a very radical Black education, kind of toned it down to become president, but we are still seeing the fruits of that agitation in the 1960s and 70s for Black studies, which kind of had roots in 1950s, Black self-affirmation, which had roots in whatever, and we can go back forever until pre-slavery times with that.
So what you're saying is that Barack Obama really is a communist?
Oh, dang. We got there. No, absolutely not. I think what's hard is people confuse radical with communist. I think communists, you have to sign the papers and you have to do everything the Communist Party says. But for Black radicals, especially a lot of the women I talked about who didn't join the Communist Party, being radical meant being true to yourself. It didn't mean being a communist. It meant carrying a Bible to the picket line. It meant working so you could provide for your family and not just to be a worker. And so I think reclaiming the term Black radicalism could be one of the next phases of the Black radical tradition, because it really encompasses a whole lot more than communism.
Well, once again, you've kind of presaged, my next question here. And
that's 4 times, I think.
It's like you're in my head, or at least in my head 5 minutes ahead of me. So just to kind of bring us to a conclusion here in our epilogue, I just wanted to kind of ask you, why study this period of time, and why study this particular topic? What is the significance of African-American female communist radicals in the Midwest in 1930?
So I have 2 anecdotes about that. First, you can go to the historical anecdote. A man named Herschel Walker, who was a recent Black migrant from the South in 1932 in St. Louis, he participated in these mass riots and at City Hall. He then went on to join labor unions, form civil rights committees in the 1950s, and trained the next generation of activists in the 1970s, who then founded Black rights organizations that continue to today and who are agitating for Black Lives Matter and related issues. So there is this direct lineage, like I've said, like one person teaches one person who teaches another person.
Each one teach one, you might say.
Yes. But I think more compelling is this kind of theory and idea of Black radical tradition that never ends. And for that, I look to my personal experience. While I was writing this, my dissertation was one of the months I was writing, it was August 2014, and that was obviously when Ferguson happened. And I was at St. Louis University when Ferguson October kind of picked up movement. There were protesters for Black Lives Matter on the clock tower kind of gathering area. And I literally walked by them every time I went to the library. So there was this literal iteration of Black radicalism in my face. And so I just couldn't ignore that as a part of this history then. And from that, I was invited to do a panel talking about the radical history of St. Louis. And from there was a woman in the audience who stood up and said, my name is Mary and I'm a Black revolutionary. And there is my dissertation came to life, is because she was so influenced by these radical events. She took the radicalism and these issues that were coming to life in front of her and made it her own, and is now a revolutionary. So, I mean, that's exactly what Carrie Smith did in 1933. And you're seeing that today. And that's kind of like that, the spirit that never really disappeared.
Well, Dr. Ford, I want to thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And as always, a big thanks to you, the listener, for listening. It's because of you that we keep doing this. And also a big thanks and appreciation to our Patreon supporters. You're the reasons we can keep doing this. If you want to be one of those supporters, you can, and are not already, you can go to patreon.com/AskHistorians, and we do a monthly donation, and then we do a monthly book giveaway as well. So if you want to get in on that, we take 4 books, which is selected by our panel of flared users on Ask Historians. We pick out 4 of them, and then the winner of the raffle gets to pick out one of those, and I ship it to their door. So if you would like to get in on that, go to patreon.com/AskHistorians. It is a $1 gets you 1 ticket in the raffle, $5 gets you 2 tickets, $10 gets you 3 tickets. So you can easily buy your way into getting a lovely semi-peer-reviewed semi-academic history book. They're all, basically the criteria is that you would feel comfortable citing them on Ask Historians. So that's our vetting process. And as you know, if you're a listener to this podcast, that can be kind of a high bar to clear. But let's talk about this episode. So this was not intended to be Ask Historians Black Lives Matters episode. It was not intended to be, a very special episode of Ask Historians. As I noted at the beginning of the show, this was recorded weeks before the most recent events, and although, of course, this is an ongoing social movement and something of public discourse and discussion, this wasn't intended to be necessarily be a comment on that. The main thrust of this episode, and I hope what you really do walk away from this episode, is a greater understanding of the Great Migration, African Americans in the early 20th century, labor movements, and the Communist Party, and just really, if you walk away from this episode more informed about that, you walk away with a great deal of knowledge, and you walk away a better person, I would think. On Ask Historians, we do tend to shy away from discussing political topics, in part because discussing historical topics as a historian, or through the historical method, or simply in the context of history, if you're looking just at the most recent events and trying to really say, what does history tell us about this? There's a problem with that, is that we don't know what those most current events, what's the really relevant portion of it. And that's why we've kind of arbitrarily on our little community on the internet, we've set a 20-year rule of saying, we don't discuss anything within the past 20 years. We put that buffer in there. So when it comes down to discussing something, we can really know what are the important things to discuss. And we don't get overwhelmed by these very, vicious discussions about modern politics. And the internet is a terrible place to discuss modern politics. And Reddit is perhaps among the worst places to discuss modern politics, but you can have your opinions on that, whether or not. But the important part is to remember is that while we can't really, as historians or people who love history, or just people who are just interested in seeing what history can tell us about the modern day, we can't look at modern events and really say, this is because of X and Y. But what we can do, the hindsight of history and using the historical method, is we can look back at past events, things like these African-American labor movements and interaction with communism and feminism and all the other factors that we talked about in this episode in the early 20th century, and then trace those ripples of history forward and say we can see a relation between modern events and the past. And while that can't really explain fully our present situation, what it can do is give us a more informed view of our present situation. It can give us a more nuanced view of our present situation. It can make us approach the situation through the full light of history and say, okay, well, I think I understand maybe something a little bit more about this, and maybe that gives me a better way to understand it. So again, this was not intended to be, a very special episode of Ask Historians. It just kind of, it drifted there, and we talked about it, and it's hard to talk about, as we've titled this episode, the Black radical tradition without following it through to, present day incarnations. So I hope you learned a lot from this episode, both of history, and I hope it gave you some new perspectives on how to think about more recent events. In the meantime, our next episode will be, kind of in the same vein, I guess you could say. Not really. It's actually going to be completely different, but also because it's history, it's going to be completely related. Just think about that for a while. It makes perfect sense. So in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the rise of guitar groups and mid-20th century pop music. So we're going to be talking about everyone from Chuck Berry to the Beatles. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, if you like the show, feel free to rate and review us. If you didn't like the show, please feel free to not rate and review us. But we are on iTunes, of course. We are also on Google Play, and we are on SoundCloud. So on any of those 3 services, you can just search for Ask Historians, and we will pop up. And you can rate and review the episodes there, or listen to our back catalog. Just keep in mind, if any of you are new users, I usually tend to advise people to start from the latest episode and then kind of skip back. Looking at, we change topics a whole lot, so skip back and looking at things that you most enjoy, because the earlier episode, the further back you go in the catalog, the rougher these episodes get. So, although there's some great information there. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you enjoy past episodes, and I hope you leave us a wonderful review and some kind words on the internet, because that's what the internet could use. See you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.